like to welcome you to the Vernon Historical Society and to our program given by Jason Newton. Barbara Muldoon and I had seen Mr. Newton give his presentation several years ago, and we quite liked it and thought it would be a really interesting one to have here. And Jason has spent time with us and taken pictures and really customized it for our area. The other thing I want to thank Mr. Newton for is he's kindly given up next weekend, either Saturday, if the weather's good, or Sunday, to take us on an interpretive walk. And all of you who have come today are in the enviable position of you can get first dibs on the walk. If we figure more than 50 people, it's hard for everybody to hear what's going on. So if you would like to go on the walk after the presentation, there'll be a sign-up sheet, and then we'll give you a copy of the map, which is your golden ticket, to be able to go. And if you, for some reason, can't make the walk and you have the map, that just came undone. Technology, That's better. If you can't make the walk after you've signed up and you want to go another time, you should be able to read the map and see where they're going. So the walk will not be a loop. They're going to start at Bread and Milk in Vernon and go through part of the Belding Land Trust and end up at the old cemetery. So you can either park at Bread and Milk, which is limited. You could also park at the cemetery, the end point, and walk to Bread and Milk. Another option is you can park in our parking lot and carpool over. So you've got different options. And speaking of the parking lot, we're so happy so many people came, and we have some spillover into the fire department lot. In the unlikely, I hope, event that the fire alarm doesn't go off, we're good. If you did happen to park in the parking lot, you could pull your car back into our lot and you could block people just to get it out of in case, we don't want the firemen mad at us. But we're hoping that it'll be for the next 2 hours, all will be quiet in Vernon. So the housekeeping is done, and now I will turn the program over to the person you've come to see, Jason Newton.
Boy, what a crowd. This is a great turnout for a Sunday afternoon of history. Who knew history could be this exciting? Is something that I do want to ask. We have technology. I've taken the step of silencing my phone. If you would put your phones on airplane mode or, yes, so it goes quiet. I think we'll all enjoy it a little bit more. My phone is very loud and noxious, so you might not want to hear it. Now, I'm here to tell you a little bit about the story of the old Connecticut path that I've been following for about 5 years. It started as a simple project, and like most simple projects, it's evolved into something that's taken on a life of its own. Here in Vernon, this picture is from Vernon. I don't know how many of you will know where it is, but we'll talk about it later in the program if you don't know for sure where it is. And I want to highlight on the fact that, given I'm 5 years into the project, that I've reached a point where people have asked me, when will there be a book? I think it's just about time to start on the book. So that will be our next year's project, and you have in your programs some information on where you can get updates. I plan to publish it out, self-published, so you'll be able to follow the progress and send some comments and feedback. A couple of upcoming events. We do have the walk here in Vernon, and another walk on October 4th up in Eastford. That'll be part of the Last Green Valleys and Eastford Historical Society. We're doing a walk at Yale Forest and Natchog State Forest on a portion of the Connecticut path. So this gets us down to, well, what have I been doing all this time? And coming up with the story. And I think I need to share some of my story and the story of the path as I've come to learn it. How it's had an effect on our American story, and I personally believe there's an American story that we share. And a little bit towards the end of how we connect this with our heritage. Now, when I started this out, everything's on the internet, and so I figured it all would be there, and I went and looked, and there was next to nothing. I'm happy to report that 5 years later, it's all about me on the internet. But I was alone, and in the process here over the last couple of years, I found that there are a lot of people who have a connection with this path and who've come and shown up here in the woods out in Nantasket State Forest on one of our walks to experience a piece of the path for themselves. Now, my connection comes through Thomas Hooker as one of my pieces, and I recall when I was young and heading for college, and my father was driving me back to college, we passed this sign, and he said, "Thomas Hooker passed through here." And like all young people, I didn't stop and say, well, tell me more about that. I've since learned that, maybe I ought to have, because I missed an opportunity. But Thomas Hooker was one of my direct ancestors. And so I didn't grow up in Connecticut, so I didn't have the history. I had to learn it as an adult much later in life here, as his role as a leader, not as just as a minister, but as a leader in the founding of New England. And my family connection, it comes through his daughter, Mary Hooker. Thomas and Susannah Hooker came over with their children, and Mary, at the time that she came over, would have been a 12-year-old walking down to Connecticut, and married Roger Newton in 1644. Family story is that, Roger came over to study. He was one of the first students at Hartford, studied for the ministry, and ran off to Connecticut and married a hooker. So I haven't had to carry the Hooker name, but you can see they still have Hooker Days down in Hartford to commemorate the impact of Thomas Hooker. I did find that it wasn't just the Hooker connection that I had, that I had several other connections with the founders of Hartford, a couple over in Wethersfield, and then this really big group over in Windsor that I think in this room we're probably got a lot of my cousins out here because we're all related in one way or another, especially with this group of people that came down to Windsor and Hartford and Wethersfield. So I set out to try and establish, after 375 years, can we really find and connect the trail? Are there places that are wild places that if you went, you'd get some sense of the experience that they might have had? And are there some artifacts that show passage of people over time along this route? And I'm happy to say, yes, I was able to succeed in doing that. Had some help along the way, that this story of the migration, the Hooker congregation in particular, was a topic of great interest 100 years ago. And there are many markers along the route, which helped me out. I was told one time by an archaeologist, how do you know all these things? He said, I read the signs. So if you read the signs and you follow them, you get a pretty good idea of the route. And I had also the help of digging into some of the ancient maps. This one, the notorious Nathaniel Woodward and his partner Solomon Sofry came through Connecticut in 1642 on a survey. They're still reviled in Connecticut, but their survey was really quite accurate on the distance and the travel from Providence across to Windsor, likely came right on through here. Another was John Winthrop Jr. In his travels. He kept a diary. He set out from Boston in 1645, and he traveled with a servant and a horse in November. Good travel plan. His destination was New London, but he wound up, instead of going directly to New London, he went across Massachusetts to Springfield, down to Windsor and Hartford, all the way down to Saybrook, back to New London, and then back home. 280 miles, 28 days in November and December. Pretty hardy guy. And Ellen Larned, who was the first woman admitted to the Connecticut Historical Society, wrote a book and tucked a neat little map in it, a treasure map of the ancient Windham County. And on it, the red line shows where she labeled the old Connecticut Path crossing. And Levi Badger Chase and his work on the Bay Path, cutting across Massachusetts. I don't know if there's some folks here from Manchester, your town city historian, Matthias Spies drew maps that showed two routes that were likely coming down across Connecticut to Hartford. And Harold Ayers in his book, The Great Trail of New England. So I had some general guidelines, but I really needed to get out and do some field work to find specific places, and that was the real fun part of the project. So I did find a consistent route that can be connected from Dorchester and from Cambridge on down to Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield. And thanks to Nathaniel Woodward in his survey, we have a pretty good idea of the colonial route from Plymouth Colony on down to Connecticut. And in looking at this, Thomas Hooker and his congregation came with 160 cows. And if you consider driving 160 cows, you're not going to go awfully fast. Cows will go at their own pace. So we figure about 10 miles a day. It was said that they traveled, it took them about a fortnight, which is 2 weeks. So if you take 10 days plus a couple days off for the Sabbaths, you get just about a fortnight. The first day would bring them out about to Route 128, and then on to Framingham, Hopkinton in Massachusetts, and down to Sutton. Then the fifth day down to Webster, to Woodstock, to Pine Hill, and closer to your home here in the Willimantic Valley. I didn't do this specifically. This has been on my program for about 3 years. But if you look at Vernon, is right about day 9, and as I looked at it really closely, it's almost right here. Now, it's not to say that they were right in this room, but close to this area. And then the last day branching down to Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield. So I have a pretty good sense of, what the flow was. And they arrived here in Connecticut as part of America's first westward migration down to the Connecticut River. And of course, it's changed dramatically going down to Hartford now. Now, history is something that we've all studied, and then we have these big black holes, gaps of what we know and don't know. And I had to confront my black hole of colonial history. You probably have one too, that we all know about the Rock, that the Mayflower pulled right up to Plymouth Rock. Everybody stepped off, they didn't get their feet wet. And now we have the tour buses all line up so they can have the same experience. And the next thing I knew about really was Lexington and Concord. Anything in between, we never really got to, because by the time we got through with the turkeys, it was on to Christmas, and then it was spring, and we had to talk about Lexington and Concord, and then the year was over. Sounds like you might have been in the same class. So I had to fill in a good bit of what was happening, and I really wondered what these folks were talking about as they were sitting by the fire, as they were after they'd crossed from England, and what they were telling their children, and what was being passed down. So that really became, how do you get into the mind of the people who were coming 380 years ago now, and what was happening in their world? So I had to really jump back to England and say, well, why did they leave in the first place? And here we have someone who's had a profound effect on our understanding of the Bible is King James. We have the King James Bible, and that was one of his good things that he did, was have the Bible translated so that a lay person could read it. He also proposed and wrote a book that expounded on the divine right of kings, that kings were above the law. Now, When James passed away, his son Charles really took him quite seriously on this, and quite literally, he suspended Parliament for a period of 11 years and ruled absolutely. And his father also left advice saying, don't trust Parliament, which he took care of, and suppress any religious dissent, particularly among Catholics on one side and the Puritans on the other. Now, Charles was married to a Catholic, so you can figure the math there at home, that the Puritans became the target of suppression in England. And as his chief advisor, Archbishop Laud, collected a list of all the ministers and identified on the list with a P if you were a Puritan minister, and then set about systematically suppressing them by silencing them and removing them from their positions. And it got very nasty, and during this period, to get an idea of the extremes that they went to, Alexander Leighton was arrested as a minister. He was arrested without charge, sent to Newgate Prison in a cold cell, isolated during the winter. They beat him, branded him, cut his ears off, split his tongue, and he survived. Another who is one of my ancestors, John Lothrop, his entire congregation was arrested and thrown in Newgate Prison. And he was kept there without charges for 2 years, 10 months. His wife died while in prison. And they wouldn't let him out unless he just left the country. They thought he was such a heretic he had to leave. So in that context, I have my ancestor here, Thomas Hooker, and what was going on with him in his world, that he was, by 1626, he was a lecturer in Chelmsford, right outside of London, and was drawing larger crowds. He was noted as an extraordinary preacher and teacher in being able to translate the Bible and the precepts that people should live by in terms that they could actually apply in their lives. So he was drawing big crowds. And of him, others had written, Cotton Mather wrote later that none could equal him. And his contemporary Samuel Collins wrote that he was an extraordinary man and he gained considerable part with the people in Essex around the area of Chelmsford. And during this time, Hooker and his family, Susannah and their children, lived in a place outside of Chelmsford, a little Bedo, called the Cuckoo's Farm. It's still there, and it's on my list of places to go visit. And while he was there, two things. His assistant that lived with the family was Reverend John Eliot, who you'll hear more about. And he also, Thomas Hooker, while at Little Bedo, he had the ministers from all over Essex. The young ministers were coming to hear and talk with him about matters of belief and faith and direction of the church. And Samuel Collins was there, and he said, he's writing this letter saying, all they can talk about is Thomas Hooker and what he's teaching. The downside was that he was writing this in a letter to Archbishop Laud to say he must be suppressed. He's winning over too many people. And the ministers are being won over. And in that time, if you wanted to suppress dissent, you suppressed the ministers, because that was the medium of communication. Today we'd turn off the internet, then you'd turn off the ministers. Sign of courage and the esteem that he was held by his peers, that 47 ministers signed a petition to Laud saying that he was teaching in a way that was consistent with Scripture and should not be persecuted. And another of Connecticut's own, of Samuel Stone, during this time, Hooker was being hunted by the secret police. It's hard to believe in England they'd have a secret police that operated like the Gestapo, that was banging on doors to find him, banged on Stone's door, and Stone stood there, a minister saying, "I saw him not an hour ago across town. Go that way." And Hooker went out the back door and into exile. So Hooker was forced to go into exile in Holland. His family was left behind and under protection of the Earl of Warwick. And Hooker was able to come back secretly and prepare to leave to come to America. And before he left, he preached a sermon saying, there will be a war. And he was talking in biblical terms, and I found out it actually came to pass. There was a war, the English Civil War, and it was anything but civil. There were armies on both sides, battles fought, and tremendous loss of life. And the Puritans, the parliamentarians, prevailed. And out of this, Archbishop Laud, the persecutor, was executed. And King Charles, the persecutor, was beheaded. So think of that, Puritans an uprising and overthrowing the king in England, on what impact that might have on the future thinking of the Puritans here in America. But things were so bad before that the Great Migration was initiated by Puritans leaving England to come to America. And over 20,000 came from England to New England in this migration. And the greater part of them came from the eastern part of England and the Massachusetts Bay Company that was led by John Winthrop. And the area that was a hotbed of Puritanism was in that zone right around Essex County, where Thomas Hooker was having increasing effect on the populace. That's where most came from. And they organized, Winthrop organized, and the Bay Company organized a fleet of ships that came to New England with between 1,000 and 1,500 people in the early 1630s. Now there was another group that I learned about here as I'm doing this project that was out on the other end of England, in the southwest, around Dorset and the counties around there, where Reverend John White set about to organize a congregation that would transplant to the New World. And they organized a new congregation in Dorchester, in England, with John Wareham and John Maverick as the ministers. The company was led by Roger Ludlow, who you'll hear more about, and Edward Rossiter. And they transplanted from England to the New England, and they left on the Mary and John a little bit ahead of the Great Migration fleet, of the Winthrop fleet. They left on March 20th and arrived in Nantasket in Massachusetts on May 30th. And they traveled on the Mary and John, and there are no real plans or descriptions of the ship, but we have some idea of the ship. If you go on down to Plymouth and take a walk on the Mayflower too, it's very much like the ships that would have been part of the Great Migration fleet. And you could see if you crammed 140 plus people below deck for 70 days, it gets kind of crowded. It'd be a long journey. The Mary and John, we have on record arriving, they got beachfront landing here at Nantasket. Last week it would have been very crowded down there on the 90-degree days because it is a popular beach area. The problem was they really wanted to be down on the other side of which Boston is now. And Captain Squibb, the captain at that time, the harbor was not mapped. So he did not know a safe channel to bring the Mary and John in to shore. So he left them on the beach. And we have a description from Roger Clapp, who wrote an autobiography. He said, we were left in this forlorn wilderness, bereft of any vegetation. It was a wild place to be left. And if we go out there today and stand on the far end of Nantasket, and you just look across this expanse of Boston Harbor, try to put yourselves in that position of being on a shore in a foreign land with no way to get across. And here's this wide space of bay that you have to find a way to get to the land that you were hoping to reach. And that reach across the bay was about 7 miles that they had to find a way to get around. It would have been over 20 miles by land with several very deep rivers to get across. So they were in a real jam to get out of. If you look across the bay from the beach, where they were headed, where they ultimately wound up heading, is where the arrow is. If your eyes are really good, you'll see there's a white dot there. You'll see what it is in just a moment. They solved their problem by using the longboats. There probably were 2 longboats on the Mary and John to row 140 people, their belongings, and it's hard to think how they'd put livestock on one of these boats, but maybe the chickens and rabbits and things, but the cows might have had to walk. Imagine your commute of doing 7 miles across the bay, rowing, with 140 people. And there's their target. They can see the great blue hill out there in the distance, and that probably was a point for them to navigate towards. And now you see a little closer as we're approaching where they were arriving, the great blue hill, and that little white dot is actually the great Dorchester gas tank. If you're stuck on Route 93 anytime, you see the gas tank there. That's about the area where they landed. So you can then have something to say when you get to Dorchester and you're sitting there and stuck in traffic. And of course the Kennedy Library in UMass. So they came in right in between there, and this is the area that they saw without the buildings. Their neighbors weren't even there yet in Boston. They arrived in Dorchester before the Winthrop fleet arrived in Boston. And Dorchester has a connection with that group. They renamed the place as Dorchester after the place that they left from in England. And if you go to Savin Hill Beach, you can be in the area where they came ashore. And they do reenact this. Here is the Dorchester Historical Society does reenact the arrival of the Mary and John. So if we go on out to Dorchester, you can visit several places that they would have known. The first is Rock Hill or Savin Hill. And with the Mayflower, they have the Rock. With the Mary and John and the folks who came, they have the Rock Hill. And if you go there, there's a monument, and it's still a desirable neighborhood. Roger Ludlow, Walcott, Rossiter, and others built their homes right around this hill, and they built a fort on the top. And it's now a Boston City Park where you can walk to the top of the hill. You can see a grassy meadow right at the top where they would have had their fort for protection. And you can look out over the ledges back across the bay that they would have had to travel in those longboats. A little further up the street is Edward Everett Square. There were a number of streets that come together there. If you go during rush hour, bring a lunch. You'll be able to have your lunch and dessert before you get through the lights. The oldest house in Boston is located there, the James Blake House. It's now run by the Dorchester Historical Society, so you can go and visit it. And around the park is the site of the first meeting house that they established in 1631. And in the park, there's a monument that says, "And when we were hungry, fish was good help unto me." And this is from Roger Clapp's autobiography. The Mary and John, they arrived in June. They had little supplies with them. The area had little timber. They had little to make shelter with, and by autumn, winter came suddenly. So they were living in primitive shelters and tents along the shore without supplies, had to live on fish if they could get it, mollusks and shells from the shore, any berries that they might be finding, and they were near starvation before a relief ship arrived in February of 1631. It was not an easy time for them or any of the other Winthrop fleet coming in. They were very near starvation that first winter. So continuing our tour, you can walk down to the old Dorchester harbor that they hoped to would be good enough for large ships. It turns out it's a very nice small boat basin. It's not deep enough for big ships. And just up the hill is a place that they knew as the Neck and was a grazing land. If you go up there, it's now a national park, but for a different reason. It's the site of the placement of cannons on Dorchester Heights to drive the British out of Boston in 1775 and 1776. But if you look out across Dorchester and what they would have known as a meadow for grazing, you can look out at the western horizon, which was their destination. And they would have been heading right towards the Newton Highlands. And that was the frontier at that time. You think of Route 128 going around Boston, that's probably about where the western frontier would have been. Beyond there, it was wild things. In Massachusetts, they still think that. Before you head west, the burial ground in Dorchester is one of Boston's oldest. It was on the Common originally, and it's at Upham's Corner, and it is likely where they would have had gathered on their journey west in 1635 and 1636. Now, there are different visions of this journey that I've come across. There's this, gosh, they left and they had compasses in their hands and it was all wilderness and they somehow stumbled into Connecticut. And the other is that, it was such a park-like walk, they had picnic baskets and it was very easy. It probably was neither of those things. Those are romanticisms. Actually, seems as though, as I got into this, it was a well-planned action to come to Connecticut. That Wakinnicut, I said it right, the chief from down here at Hartford came up and tried to convince Governor Winthrop, send people down to Connecticut, that we have good land down here. And Winthrop didn't really want to have anything to do with him and suspected problems, but there were others who heard about this, and among them was John Oldham, who came down in 1633 by land, and came down again with a group to Wethersfield, and reported back. Word was that there was a path, and it was a safe path from village to village, Indian village to village. And in Windsor and in Hartford, they commemorate the adventurers who came down in 1635 as the advance teams to find the way and identify the best places to settle. And so they really were ready in 1636 to come in large groups. And it is on record that the Dorchester Company left in April 1636 and likely headed off to the area of Roxbury in Boston. And if we head on over there is where we come across John Eliot, who was the minister at that time in Roxbury. And Eliot is known as the apostle to the Indians because during his lifetime, he set about to establish praying villages among the natives along the path that was followed. We believe it's close to the path that was followed going west. And in his role, he also translated the Bible into Algonquian. And I'm told that it's now being used to help reestablish Algonquian as a spoken language. Think of the Bible as sort of like the Rosetta Stone of Algonquian, thanks to John Eliot. But he did have and traveled extensively on a line of praying villages that ran all the way down to Weebaquasit, which is now the area of Woodstock in Connecticut. So we have a pretty good idea of following the villages of a likely route. And it would have led west from Roxbury on the Bay Path and across the Emerald Necklace. Here we have Jamaica Pond, and a key person there was Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a Connecticut-born person whose ancestors were among the founders of Hartford and Windsor. And Olmsted was also instrumental in the National Park movement, and his company was responsible for more than 500 park projects, among them Central Park and the grounds around the state capitol here in Connecticut. Just a little bit further in the western horizon there, at the Charles River, was the crossing on above the upper falls of the Charles. And I came across the fact that the natives, the Indians, had established that this was a fishing ground, and they'd put rocks across the river so that at times they could step across the river. And if you go there today, it is a reserve that you can walk down along the river. The field next to the river is likely where the Indians dried their fish. There's a fish catching place when the fish run. The falls are now dammed. And you can walk down the river. It's a beautiful spot on the western frontier. We'll leave that group for just a moment here because we have this other group that was packing up in 1636, the Hooker Company. And Thomas Hooker and his family arrived in 1633. Almost immediately there was talk about moving west. You have to understand that Dorchester and Cambridge, they were a limited space and they had people coming in and there was limited room to expand. So they really had to talk about space-wise, we need to find room to spread out. And there were differences, political and religious differences, that made it better to move on. So Hooker and his company, we have on record from John Winthrop in his journal, that Mr. Hooker and most of his company, along with those 160 cows, headed off to Connecticut on May 30th. So they left, say, about a month after the Dorchester congregation. Now, if they were all following the same path, it's come up as questions, well, how did they know where the path was? And you think if you have the Dorchester congregation driving cows down this path, it's going to be well marked by the time the Hooker congregation comes through. And following their route out along the old post road through Weston, you come to Wayland, and there's this sign by the side of the road. There's this street that has been forever known as Old Connecticut Path. And it crosses all of Wayland, and it's quite beautiful going across. You actually have places that are preserved that look very much like the land that they might have encountered. And coming down to Framingham, where there is a monument to honor the natives who brought corn to the settlers in Boston in 1630 and 1631 when they were near starvation. So the paths from Dorchester, the Dorchester congregation, John Wareham, and that group came, and Thomas Hooker come together in the area around Framingham. And likely at one of the ponds, and this one is Washacum Pond, right on the path. And then you have to stop and think of all the place names in New England, how many of them are rooted in native Indian names, that it's part of their legacy left behind. About 2 miles over the hill was one of John Eliot's praying villages, the Magunko praying village, and the trail actually went across the Wildwood Cemetery and down into the valley to a place called Pout Rock on Cold Spring Brook. And you can go down to the brook today, and there's an inscription on the rock by the Ashland Historical Society going back to about 1900 of this was where the Hooker party and the Old Connecticut Path crossed. There's another migration each year in reverse from Hopkinton, where they have a sign for the Bay Path and a monument for the pioneer travelers, but now they have 30 to 35,000 travelers arrive to go in reverse down a good portion of the route on their way to Boston as part of the marathon. And Hopkinton is celebrating its 300th anniversary, and the town is named for Edward Hopkins, a founder of Hartford. Just beyond in Hopkinton, we begin to reach some really wild lands, and the transition occurs that at Whitehall Pond, which was one of the places that there's some indication the Hooker Party camped on their journey, it's now preserved as a state park. And if you go just up the hill, you're at an intersection of trails, and we're thinking, if you've been to 495 and the Mass Pike, it's an intersection of trails. The natives, 400 years ago, had trails that intersected right there that were long-distance travel trails. So we think of our highway system today, it tends to follow closely with things that the natives figured out centuries ago. And as we come over the hill from Whitehall into Grafton, we find in Upton and Grafton there's a piece of the trail that is actually quite pure, coming down the hill. And you could almost, when you walk there, envision a group walking down the hill on their way west. Into Hassanemesset, which is another of the praying villages established by John Eliot, is now Grafton Center. The paths broke, and those who were headed west, there were groups at this same time period that were going west to Springfield. They would have followed the Bay Path, but those headed to Connecticut might have branched off right in the area of Grafton and crossed the Blackstone into what is now Sutton. In Sutton, they have a post road marker that's much like the one that's just across the street from here. It was an early post road direct down to Connecticut. And if you follow just a little further across Sutton, there's an extraordinarily beautiful place called Waters Farm on Manchog Pond, which is now preserved by the town and the Manchog Pond Association. And they're having their Waters Farm Day just coming up in a couple of weeks. It's an extraordinarily beautiful place to go, and it was likely the site of the Manchog Praying Village. And from there, we really enter the deep woods, that there is a woodland between Manchog Praying Village and what's now Webster that's truly extraordinary. There's over 15,000 acres that's in public protection in 3 states, in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, right around this area. So if you wanted some wilderness, you don't have to go far, but I found that even coming to Connecticut, I was in the wilderness. Leading down to what we call Webster Lake now, and across to the Chowbungamog Praying Village. This program today, it's not long enough for me to try to pronounce the name. We'll just call it Webster Lake. But if we look at this, across these praying villages, there's a fairly direct line of travel, and there's a great large a greenway in there. And this was a surprise to me in doing this, that there are substantial areas that we can go out into the woods. Now, just this year, we have our newest national park in the United States, the Blackstone Valley National Heritage Park. And we have a reauthorized Las Green Valley National Heritage Corridor. And the Old Connecticut Path crosses both of those. And there are some extraordinarily beautiful areas along the way. And a key to finding them is a map, again by Ellen Larned back in 1874, that you want to do treasure hunting, you follow her map and you'll find treasure, I promise you. One of the places that you'd find is the crossing of the Quinnebog River, which is a national scenic river under the protection of the Army Corps of Engineers. It's public land now that you can go and explore. And if you're there at the right time, Osier Brook has this wonderful cascade that drops right into the Quinnebog River at the site of a mill that was there from the founding of the town in the early 1700s and where the path would have crossed. 4 miles of woodland and you wind up in what was Wabequasset. Later was named New Roxbury because it was settled by folks coming out from Roxbury and then renamed Woodstock. And the Woodstock Historical Society and the New England Historic Genealogical Society sponsored a program where we brought folks out from their come home to New England to Woodstock to walk a portion of the trail. And Woodstock runs many programs of historic interest, among them some walks, along their section that they've identified and had accepted in the National Register of Historic Places as the Old Connecticut Path. Deeper into the woods, there's something that Connecticut really ought to perk up and pay attention to, that there is a portion of over 11 miles of the path, of which 9.6 miles, I measured it out, is open either on the path or in parallel to it as public access. So there's great potential to connect this as a wilderness walkway that is along the route of the path. And so we've been trying to bring folks out to walk along the path, and at Camp Nahako in Eastford, last fall we brought out a group, and it turned out that like 75 people showed up to walk with us and talk about the natural history and the history of the people. And the Eastford Historical Society now has this as a stop for their town history for their school groups. Coming up in a couple weeks, we're going to take a walk into the woods at Yale Forest and Natchog State Forest. It's about as close as you can get walking right up to the edge of a beaver dam and down to the Bigelow Brook. And Bigelow Brook has a special place in the story. The large rock here, you recall I said that when they crossed the Charles River at the Upper Falls, there were stones set across the river. There is a story from Charles Chisholm that Harold Ayres also did, that he walked out, and Chisholm, when he was going to school, walked across the Bigelow Brook on the stones, because the school was on the other side of the brook. And there was a set of stones walking across, and this is one of them. And Ayres walked across this. He went back in 1939 after the hurricane of 38, and the great flood washed away most, but there is one of them remaining. So we're going to walk down and stand on the stone as part of our program. And just beyond there, on the Chisholm Farm up in Ashford, there's a hill with an old ancient roadway that Larned said that this was the encampment on Pine Hill in Ashford. And the Connecticut Historic Commission did a study on this, looking at maps and surveys, and came up with the fact that this abandoned road is the most likely candidate for the Connecticut Path. And it's sitting just up on top of the hill, been bypassed for probably 250 years by the road that's just down at the bottom of the hill. In Natchog Forest, we've had a walk with Connecticut Forest and Parks. There's a portion of the Natchog Trail that actually runs directly on what's believed to be the Connecticut Path. So it's remarkable at this point, and one of the trail managers put up a sign saying, "This trail's been in use for 400 years." Sponsored by the Connecticut Forest and Parks, and they do great work, and they've been great supporters of this project. So we again draw out a good crowd to come and walk and have that experience. If you just want to drive, there is a monument in Ashford on the highway for John Oldham, John Wareham, and Thomas Hooker, commemorating their passage down the path. A great surprise on the western side of Ashford and into Willington is a 2-mile section connected that's still there, that's open for public access, that follows what the Connecticut Historical Commission and I agreed is the likely course of the path. And we had a group up there a year ago, and again, a wonderful turnout to come and walk and experience it. And I like to go on the walks with a naturalist so we can talk about the people coming through and the natural history, the changes in the environment. And it's a really extraordinary place. The Joshua Trust owns a preserve there at Fleagle Farm that is an extraordinary place that's available and open for walking along the path. And as you can see, it's just a nice, comfortable walk over a 2-mile span down to Fenton Ruby Park in Willington, which is a beautiful place to walk 5 miles off of Route 84. So all those people who are going up 84 and leaving Connecticut to go to the mountains and to the wilderness, they could just get to the wilderness very easily right off the highway. And we did have over 75 people come out to walk the path there at Ruby Fenton. So if you're looking for a nice walk coming up in the fall, there's plenty where you can go and walk the path. And we'll be having one over here in Vernon in next week. Now, the Old Connecticut Path Historical Commission, we agreed on a couple of things. We agreed pretty much coming across from Thompson on down to Willington. We had some disagreement because they said, gee, we have Matthias Spiess, and he said it went through Bolton Notch. So we've got to try and connect it some way or another. So they just arbitrarily said, this is a weak link. We don't have any evidence. We don't have anything on the ground, any traditions, but we'll draw it for now as a connection. In looking at the history and digging out some letters from Matthias Spiess back and forth to Harold Ayres, they're over in the Connecticut Historical Society, he had the answer and as an alternative. He said, Woodward and Saffrey, they went across there in 1642, and he knew how they probably would have walked if you did it by roads, because he'd walked it from Willington on over to the old ferry to Windsor. And he said, if they got to Tolland, which I learned how to say it properly, it's not Toland, it's Tolland. If they got to Tolland, they would have just followed the Nipmuc Trail on down to Hartford. He said that's how they would have done it. So as a consequence, it does seem to fit together with a better fit with the Connecticut Path, with the Connecticut Historic Commission. And I did find, with some help from Tim Gaudier, Tolland resident, some actual physical evidence on the ground that would connect the path going across Tolland, coming up from Nyholman and the Willimantic River. You can follow the old road. If you get to the state trooper barracks, the barracks is sitting right on it, which is nice. It's preserved in the woods there. And coming up to Tolland Green, Tim has done some remarkable work on the western part of Tolland, where he's compiled, I think he had something like 6,000 or more land records going back to the 1700s, maybe even earlier. And he was able to identify the earliest routes through town. And he came up with 3. The one to the north went up around the north side of Shenipsett Lake. He had one that roughly parallels Route 74, which he labeled, for a name purpose, the Connecticut Path. And then he had this one that's really intriguing that even in the deeds was labeled the Old Windsor Path. So think about that. They came up with a new way, which might have been this one along Route 74 approximately. But the old way went over Old Post Road and over the hill and down to the border along Gage's Brook into Vernon.
Jason, just for the record, it was in 1721 in the deed that it was called the Old Windsor Path.
So 1721 in the records, it was the Old Windsor Path, meaning it's been there a long time. And it has been bypassed. There's a section of it that's been bypassed and reshaped. But leading into Vernon, we have something coming that's likely along the course of Tolland Turnpike with some variation. Vernon, I came to find, again, has this wonderful wilderness greenway in the Tankerhoosen Valley that you can actually walk from one end of Vernon to the other on the Shenipsett Trail and the Hot River State Park Trail. You can walk from one end of town to the other and have some real wilderness experience. And we're going to go out and take a look at a portion of it next week. So you have this connection from the entry into Tolland with the Lafayette Monument, on down to the Talcottville Historic District. And right in the center of it, not too far away, there's this place called Meeting House Hill, where the first meeting house in North Vernon was established. And if you go on up there, and a little bit hazy day, you get up on the hill and you look right down the valley at their destination of down the valley towards Hartford. And we have a somewhat more idealized view. Hans Weiss painted this from his view of the hill, looking down the valley from Meeting House Hill. Now, you remember that picture at the beginning of the program? That is a picture. It's a remarkable one that I was able to get from a piece of video. So it's an aerial view of Meeting House Hill and the old roadway that still exists there along the way down from the top of Meeting House Hill. Now, there's some question, is this thing called the road from Meeting House Hill part of the Connecticut path or that old Windsor path? And part of my method has been to look at establishing lines and then go out and look for evidence. So if we took the line from Tim's place where the old Windsor path ends and comes into Vernon and run it down to Talcottville, it runs along the line of the hills and across Meeting House Hill. So as future research, if there's someone here in the Vernon Historical Society who wants to dig into deeds, this would be a pretty good target to find. Is that a piece of an ancient pathway? And if you need a resource, Tim Gaudier is right next door working with the Tolland Historical Society. Now, there's another variation that I'm thinking may have occurred because, cows get thirsty. And if they walked 160 cows this distance, they're not going to want to stay on the hill. They're going to want to go where the water is. And likely by the shape of the land would come down the hill into the area of where we now have building and down the valley towards Talcottville that way. So we're going to go out to the wildflower meadow, and when I heard that the wildflower meadow was originally a cornfield, I had a different vision of this kind of cornfield. That those settlers coming down, this was land of the Podunks, and they would be likely establishing their cornfields and plantings down right in that area around Belding, and that would have been ideal for them in raising corn. And the other thing that I found there in going through this area is that this is a remarkable collection of names of people who are connected with the foundings of Windsor and Hartford. And among them is Moses Thrall, who wound up settling here. His great-grandfather was William Thrall, who came down with Wareham and settled in 1636 in Windsor. His great-grandson came out and settled here in Vernon and wound up owning a good bit of the land that's now protected in the Tankerhusen Greenway in the Belding Preserve. So we're going to go out there next week and try to connect the natural history of the land as it's preserved today with the connection of the people who came to settle here.